It was supposed to be a normal day. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unusual. I stepped outside with my family, carrying the same mindset we all carry every day, that the world will behave the way it always has. That routine protects us. It makes life feel predictable, safe, familiar. I remember small details clearly. The casual conversations, the absence of urgency, the way time felt ordinary. There was no warning inside my body, no intuition telling me something was about to shift. My mind was relaxed, unguarded, functioning on autopilot. That's how most shocks enter our lives, quietly, without permission. And then it happened. Not slowly, not logically. Suddenly, authority appeared where none was expected. Voices sounded firm, but explanations were missing. Questions formed in my mind faster than answers arrived. Before I could fully process what was happening, the atmosphere changed. The air felt heavier. My body tensed instinctively, even though my mind was still trying to treat it as a misunderstanding. I looked at my family, expecting reassurance, expecting clarity. Instead, I saw confusion mirrored back at me. That's when fear first entered. Not loud fear, but the subtle kind that tightens your chest. The kind that tells you something important has shifted, even if you don't yet understand how. I tried to speak, to understand, to ground myself in logic. But logic doesn't work when power moves faster than explanation. Decisions were being made around me, not with me. My identity reduced to a presence, not a voice. As I was separated from my family, a strange disconnection began. Not emotional at first, psychological. Like watching your own life from a distance. The mind does this when reality moves too fast. It creates space so you don't shatter immediately. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about guilt or innocence. I wasn't thinking about consequences or outcomes. I was thinking about disbelief. How quickly a normal life can slip out of your hands. How fragile the idea of freedom really is when it's tested without warning. My body followed instructions, but my mind lagged behind, struggling to catch up. Every step felt unreal. Every sound felt sharper. The world hadn't ended, but my relationship with it had already begun to change. As I was taken away, the sense of time began to distort. Minutes felt longer than they should, yet everything moved too fast to understand. The mind couldn't decide whether to panic or to stay still, so it hovered somewhere in between, alert, tense, and confused. What stayed with me the most was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of explanation. No clear reason, no reassurance, just procedures being followed as if this moment were ordinary. That contrast between how normal it seemed to them and how unreal it felt to me deepened the shock. I became acutely aware of how powerless a person can feel when stripped of context. When you don't know what you're being accused of, your thoughts turn inward. You begin to question yourself, not your actions, but your assumptions about safety, fairness, and control. My body reacted before my mind did. Tight muscles, shallow breathing, a heaviness in the chest that came and went in waves. The nervous system had entered survival mode, preparing for threats that hadn't been defined yet. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the last normal second before everything shifted. The conversation with my family, the expression on their faces. That mental replay wasn't intentional. It was my mind trying to return to a point where things still made sense. There was also a quiet sense of humiliation, not because of guilt, but because of exposure. Being seen in a position you never imagined yourself in. Being reduced to a situation instead of a person. That kind of vulnerability hits deeper than fear. As the surroundings changed, so did my awareness. Every sound felt louder. Every movement felt deliberate. I noticed how the mind becomes hyper-focused in moments of uncertainty, scanning for meaning and details that would normally go unnoticed. I realized then how little we think about freedom until it's interrupted, how invisible it is when it's present, and how overwhelming it feels when it's questioned. In that moment, freedom wasn't a concept. It was a sensation slowly slipping away. The hardest part wasn't knowing what would happen next. It was realizing that for now, I had no control over the story being written around me. And that loss of control created a kind of mental weight that settled in quietly, without asking for permission. When the environment finally changed, it felt like crossing an invisible line. Not a physical boundary, but a mental one. The moment you realize you're no longer moving freely, the mind reacts in a way words struggle to explain. Everything becomes sharper, heavier, more deliberate. Even standing still feels different when you know you're not doing it by choice. I noticed how quickly dignity becomes fragile. Simple things, where to stand, when to speak, where to look, were no longer mine to decide. It wasn't violent. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, and somehow, that made it worse. The calmness of the system made my confusion feel smaller, less important. My thoughts started fragmenting. I couldn't hold on to one idea for long before another interrupted it. Questions overlapped each other. How long? Why? What now? But none of them had answers, so they circled endlessly. The mind doesn't like open loops. When it can't close them, it exhausts itself trying. I became aware of how the body protects itself when the mind feels cornered. Emotions dulled slightly. Fear didn't disappear, but it lost its sharp edges. This wasn't strength, it was shock management. A way to keep functioning without collapsing. There was also anger, but it stayed buried. Not explosive anger. A quiet, restrained kind. The kind that sits deep because expressing it feels unsafe. When power imbalance is clear, the mind learns to stay silent even when it wants to scream. I thought about my family again. Not in detail, just as a presence. The idea that they were somewhere else, living the same day that had just shattered for me. That separation made everything feel more unreal, like my life had split into two timelines without my consent. I noticed how identity begins to blur in moments like this. You stop thinking of yourself as who you are and start thinking of yourself as what is happening to you. Labels replace names. Situations replace stories. And slowly, you feel yourself shrinking inside that frame. Time continued moving, but meaning felt suspended. Nothing felt connected to the life I knew before. And yet, my mind kept searching for familiarity, a thought, a sensation, anything that could remind me I was still myself beneath the circumstances. That search wasn't about hope or escape. It was about anchoring, about not letting the situation rewrite me completely, about holding on to awareness in a place designed to make you feel reduced. As the minutes stretched, I became aware of how silence behaves in confined situations. It isn't empty. It presses inward. Every pause feels amplified. Every sound feels intrusive. Even breathing starts to feel louder than it should, like your body is reminding you that it's still there even when your choices are limited. I realized how quickly the mind starts negotiating with reality. You replay recent moments, searching for a different outcome, a different sentence, a different second where everything could have shifted. Not because it helps, but because the brain is trying to regain control by rewriting the past when it can't influence the present. There was a strange awareness of observation, not just being seen, but being assessed. You begin to measure your own movements, your tone, your posture, because you don't know which small thing might matter. It teaches you how thin the line is between being a person and being a situation. I felt my emotional range narrowing, not disappearing, just compressing. Fear, confusion, frustration, disbelief, they stopped arriving one by one and started blending into a single heavy sensation. It sat in my chest, steady and unmoving, like a weight you forget is there until you try to stand up straight. What surprised me most was how memory worked in that moment. Instead of dramatic highlights, small, ordinary images surfaced. A family laugh from earlier, the sound of traffic, a normal day that had ended without warning. These memories didn't comfort me. They reminded me of contrast, of how easily normal life can slip out of reach. I also noticed a subtle shift inside, a decision without words. Not surrender, not resistance, adjustment. The mind recognizing that panic would only deepen the damage. So it slows everything down, rationing thoughts the way you ration breath underwater. There was no clarity, but there was awareness. And in that awareness, something important stayed intact. I wasn't defined by what was happening. The situation had power, but it didn't own my inner space unless I handed it over. That realization didn't make anything easier, but it made me steadier. In moments where control is taken, steadiness becomes the last form of freedom. As the situation settled into its reality, I began to notice how quickly the human mind adapts to confinement. Not acceptance, not comfort, but a recalibration. You stop asking when this will end and start focusing on how to exist inside it. The mind lowers its expectations quietly, without announcing it, like dimming a light so the eyes don't strain as much. I became hyper-aware of small details. The texture of the floor beneath my feet, the way light entered the space, filtered and dull. The rhythm of footsteps passing by. When freedom is reduced, awareness expands in strange directions. Things you'd never notice in normal life suddenly feel important, almost symbolic. There was a constant effort to remain composed, not because anyone demanded it, but because losing composure felt like losing the last thing that belonged to me. Emotional control turned into a survival mechanism. I learned how much energy panic consumes and how quickly it leaves you empty afterward. Staying calm wasn't bravery, it was efficiency. Thoughts about fairness surfaced, then faded. Not because they weren't valid, but because they had nowhere to go. In moments like this, justice feels abstract. What matters is endurance. The ability to sit with uncertainty without letting it corrode you from the inside. I noticed how vulnerability becomes invisible in systems like these. Fear isn't loud. Confusion isn't dramatic. Most of the struggle happens internally, quietly, where no one sees it. And because it's unseen, it feels unreal, like it doesn't deserve acknowledgement. That invisibility makes you question your own emotions. Time felt uneven. Some moments dragged endlessly. Others vanished without leaving a trace. Without control over movement or decisions, the concept of time loses its structure. You're no longer moving through time. Time is moving over you. There was also a deep awareness of how easily this could happen to anyone. How thin the line is between an ordinary day and an altered life. That realization stripped away any illusion of permanence I had about safety or predictability. Through it all, a quiet resolve stayed present. Not hope, not optimism, just the determination to remain internally intact, to observe without breaking, to experience without letting the experience erase who I was before it began. As more time passed, I became aware of how isolation reshapes self-perception. Without familiar voices, without routine interactions, the mind starts turning inward. You replay conversations differently. You question your own reactions. You examine yourself more harshly than you ever would in normal life. It's not self-reflection for growth. It's self-scanning for mistakes, for explanations, for reasons this moment exists. I noticed how quickly empathy becomes selective in such environments. You start observing others closely, not out of judgment, but out of recognition. Small gestures stand out: a nod, a brief glance, a neutral tone instead of a harsh one. When circumstances strip away comfort, even basic human neutrality feels significant. There was a constant tension between staying alert and not becoming overwhelmed. Too much awareness led to anxiety. Too little led to numbness. The mind tried to balance itself, switching between the two without warning. That fluctuation was exhausting, but it kept me functional. I felt my sense of autonomy shrinking in subtle ways. Not through force, but through repetition. Being told where to stand, when to wait, when to move. Each instruction alone meant nothing. Together, they slowly trained compliance. It made me realize how control doesn't always arrive aggressively. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as routine. At moments, I caught myself shrinking emotionally, not expressing confusion, not asking questions, choosing stillness over expression. It wasn't fear alone, it was calculation. The instinct to minimize presence when presence feels risky. That instinct stays with you longer than the situation itself. I also became aware of how fragile certainty is. Things I believed strongly about safety, fairness, and predictability felt less solid. Not shattered, but cracked. Enough to let doubt seep in. Enough to change how I would see the world afterward. Despite everything, something inside refused to disconnect completely. There was a steady inner voice reminding me to stay aware, to remember details, to stay mentally present. Not for anyone else, for myself. Because when experiences like this end, memory is the only proof you existed fully inside them. And in that awareness, I understood something quietly but clearly. Situations can restrict movement, but they only fully win when they shrink your sense of self. Holding on to that sense became an act of resistance, even if no one else could see it. At some point, the shock stopped dominating and a heavier realization settled in. This wasn't just a moment anymore. It was an experience that would leave residue. The kind that doesn't disappear when circumstances change. The mind began cataloging sensations unconsciously, as if preparing to remember this later whether I wanted to or not. I noticed how control over emotion became more deliberate. Instead of reacting, I started observing myself reacting. watching fear rise, watching it fall, watching how quickly the body adapts when it realizes panic won't change the outcome. That distance between feeling and reaction created a strange calm, not peace, but manageability. There was a growing awareness of how systems reshape behavior without force. You begin aligning yourself with expectations even when they aren't spoken. Movements become economical. Words become fewer. The instinct to explain fades because explanation feels useless when no one is listening for understanding. I thought again about freedom, not as a concept, but as a series of unnoticed privileges. Choosing when to speak, choosing when to move, choosing when to be alone. Losing those choices made me realize how invisible freedom is until it's removed. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It simply exists until it doesn't. The body carried tension quietly, shoulders tight, jaw clenched without realizing it, breathing shallow, then corrected consciously. It amazed me how the body reacts faster than thought, how it prepares for threat even when danger is undefined. Survival doesn't wait for logic. I became aware of how vulnerability hides behind composure. From the outside, everything probably looked fine. Calm posture, neutral expression. Inside, there was constant recalculation, measuring safety, measuring tone, measuring presence. That internal labor is exhausting, but it remains invisible to anyone not experiencing it. There was also a subtle shift in perspective. The world outside felt distant, almost unreal. News, conversations, routines, all of it seemed irrelevant compared to the immediacy of the moment. When your environment shrinks, your priorities shrink with it. Everything becomes about staying intact, staying aware, staying human. I understood then how easily people are changed by environments like this. Not dramatically, gradually, through repetition, through silence, through adaptation that feels necessary at the time but leaves marks afterward. And I could feel those marks beginning to form, quietly, without permission. Eventually, the moment arrived when the situation began to loosen its grip. Not all at once, not dramatically, but subtly. A shift in tone, a change in movement, the sense that control was no longer completely outside of me. And yet, even as circumstances changed, I realized something important had already happened inside. I wasn't the same person who had walked into this situation earlier. Not broken, altered. I became aware of how experiences like this rewrite your internal map. Things you once considered stressful now feel small. Things you once ignored now feel essential. Safety, dignity, presence, connection, they stop being abstract ideas and start feeling physical, real, fragile. I noticed how silence followed me even when noise returned. How my mind stayed alert longer than necessary. How my body didn't immediately trust relief. That's how you know something mattered. Not because it hurt loudly, but because it lingered quietly. What stayed with me most was clarity. Not about the system, not about blame, but about myself. About how quickly life can change without warning. About how strength isn't always visible. Sometimes it's simply staying aware when everything tries to reduce you. Sometimes it's choosing not to let a moment define your entire identity. I understood that many people carry experiences like this without ever speaking about them. They return to normal life on the outside, while something inside stays rearranged. And because they don't talk about it, the weight stays invisible, shared silently, endured privately. This experience didn't teach me how to be fearless. It taught me how to stay present inside fear. It didn't make me stronger in the loud, dramatic way people admire. It made me steadier in the quiet way that actually lasts. And if you're listening to this and you've been through something that changed you without anyone noticing, know this: you're not weak for feeling altered. You're human. Awareness after disruption is not damage. It's depth. If this story resonated with you, if it put words to something you felt but never explained, stay connected here. This channel exists for the moments people don't talk about, the inner shifts, the silent struggles, the truths that don't fit into headlines. Subscribe if you value stories that don't shout but stay with you. Because understanding ourselves is the first step toward not losing ourselves.